The amazing structures that surround us, the bridges, towers, and great public buildings, all have a story to tell. Behind nearly every one of these triumphs is an untold drama of a world that might have been. In this series, I'm exploring ambitious ventures by some of our greatest architects and engineers, but which ultimately remained on the drawing board. Travelling to France, I'll uncover the story of a daring engineer who risked his life for a channel crossing, but who died having built nothing. And I'll discover why events leading up to the First World War might have turned the north of Scotland into an offshore island. This is a story of international relations, of canals, tunnels, and changing attitudes, and of an island nation in fear of opening the front door to her neighbours. Welcome to the remarkable world of Unbuilt Britain. By profession, I'm an architectural historian, and I spend a lot of time searching for evidence that throws light on the buildings of the past. My research tells me that history is littered with failed grand designs, and the archives are full of bold schemes that were never built. I want to find out why.
There are different kinds of unbuilt projects. Some are so visionary, you can see in later built works where those inspirations came from.
Tracing this history of the unbuilt leads to some extraordinary engineering schemes. There have been countless plans over the years to connect mainland Britain to the outside world. In the 19th century, there were proposals for a tunnel to Ireland, an idea that has never entirely been taken off the table. There was even an idea for a great belt railway that would have spanned the world all the way to Australia. Projects on such a grand scale often fall victim to the politics of their age, and the two schemes that I want to investigate are typically full of intrigue and beset by xenophobia. Before the First World War, fear of invasion inspired a bold idea to drive a sea lane the size of the Panama Canal through the heart of Scotland. Known as the Mid-Scotland Ship Canal, it would have cut the country in half. But first, I'll discover how early unbuilt plans for a channel tunnel ultimately helped to make that fixed link between Britain and France possible. This exploration of unbuilt Britain involves a train journey from London through a tunnel under the English Channel to Paris. 20 years ago, such a trip wouldn't have been possible. But now more than 27,000 people travel between France and Britain by train every day. And it's on the other side of the Channel that our story begins. Thanks to the Channel Tunnel that opened in 1994, we now have a fixed connection from the heart of London to France and beyond. We're just approaching the tunnel now. These 31 miles of tunnel under the Channel took 8 years to build. The momentous breakthrough linking France and Britain came at 11 o'clock on the 1st of December 1990, when the last wall of rock fell.
They're through! They're through! They're through! Hey!
But it had been a very long time coming. For over 200 years, the hopes of engineers and architects had been thwarted by a turbulent history and the fear of invasion. Curiously, the first known plan for a fixed link across the Channel was actually conceived in the middle of a continental war. The year was 1802. Napoleon's armies had been ravaging mainland Europe for almost a decade.
Napoleon had armies at Boulogne and at Cherbourg and at Flushing and was planning to invade England. This was the nightmare scenario. This was the darkest hour of England's history when we stood alone against this overwhelming enemy.
To conceive of a plan to link the two countries permanently at this time required a serious leap of the imagination. But the man with that early vision, Albert Mathieu Favier, believed in a better world. Taking advantage of a lull in hostilities, Mathieu Favier designed a tunnel that would allow travellers to avoid the stormy waters of the Channel and speed up the journey time between London and Paris. Mathieu Favier's idea was for a single tunnel dug under the Channel. It was designed for use by horse-drawn stagecoaches and had tall ventilation chimneys reaching high above the waves. Napoleon Bonaparte was said to like the idea, but the British were suspicious, thoroughly convinced that this was a cunning plan for French invasion. Mathieu Favier undoubtedly had ideas ahead of his time, but unlike the buildings behind me, the peace of the day was not built to last. By May of 1803, Britain and France were enemies once again, and his plans, whether drawn up in peacetime or otherwise, were forgotten. The demise of Mathieu Favier's plan is an augury for the future direction of our tale.
The very idea of building a tunnel brought out the worst rabid, xenophobic, anti-French reactions imaginable. France was an inveterate, long-term, permanent enemy. Building a tunnel linking England and France was just inviting trouble.
The story of the Channel Tunnel is a mirror of European history, and in particular, the ever-shifting relations between France and Britain through war, enmity, and finally peace. It would take nearly 200 years and dozens of unbuilt plans to realise the dream, and Mathieu Favier was just one in a long line of daring engineers who would try to complete this Herculean project. If Mathieu Favier can be marked down as a bit of a visionary, then the next man in line, Monsieur Louis-Joseph Aimé Thomé de Gamont, not only had a grandiloquent name, but he clearly had the ambition to match. This man was the original tunnel pioneer. Born in Poitiers in 1807, Thomé de Gamont was a highly educated man with doctorates in medicine and law. But de Gamont's real passion lay under the sea. A generation after Mathieu Favier had dreamt of a tunnel beneath the Channel, de Gamont devoted his life to the idea of a permanent link between Britain and France. I've come to the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris to find out more about de Gamont's pioneering research from historian Laurent Bonneau.
I think what set him apart from his peers was his scientific mind and the continuity in his surveying and research. He was very early in thinking about cross-channel fixed links, and he was extremely scientific in his way of doing things. He was systematic. He was very rigorous. He really put all his means, everything he had in terms of time, finances, and even taking physical risks into this project.
In 1833, Thomé de Gamont's lifelong study of a channel crossing began. He didn't just imagine a tunnel linking England and France. His initial ideas included a cast iron tube laid along the seabed.
The trains would travel simply through this tube, but it was not realistic due to the streams, the very strong streams through the channel.
After ruling out 8 other methods, de Gamond was finally convinced that a tunnel was the way forward. But to proceed, he had to establish if the rocks beneath the waves were suitable for tunnelling. What happened next demonstrates de Gamond's astonishing level of commitment to his cause. Risking all, the 48-year-old Frenchman took a deep breath and dropped into the freezing waters of the channel. This was long before modern diving techniques had been developed, and de Gamond had no means of breathing beneath the waves. Weighed down with bags that were filled with 86 kilos of flint stones, and with his ears protected from the immense water pressure by pads of buttered lint, de Gamond sank to a depth of over 30 meters to carry out the first recorded survey of the channel seabed. There, he fought off strong currents and creatures of the deep.
He used cloth around the neck to protect himself from being bitten by conger eels or such fishes, which happened to him actually. It was really not sophisticated at all.
And quite a considerable personal danger.
And it was also very cold.
Despite these incredibly adverse conditions, de Gamond managed to return from the seabed with rock samples that would prove to be hugely important.
Thomas de Gamond discovered that there was a continuity of chalk layers from the Jurassic time. The tunnel had to follow one of the layers as much as possible in order to avoid breakthrough of water.
De Gamond's discovery was momentous and justified the risks he'd taken to get his samples. He had proved that the geology of the Straits of Dover was perfect for a channel tunnel. And in 1856, de Gamond drew up a detailed master plan based on 20 years of solitary, painstaking research. This shows us a section of the tunnel, Laurent. What were some of its features?
It was a single tunnel with brick walls and a double railway track. Interestingly enough, the diameter of the tunnel was roughly 7 meters, which is close to the current existing tunnel. Obviously, one of the biggest problems was how to ventilate this tunnel. How would people breathe, travelers breathe through nearly 40 kilometers?
Thomas de Gamond came up with a novel solution to the ventilation problem. On a sandbank in the channel called the Varne, he proposed building an artificial island. He called it the Étoile de Varne.
The Étoile de Varne offered the possibility to make a stop, to make a break in the middle of the channel for the travelers by train who get out and breathe the fresh air. The Étoile de Varne would be the place where travelers from all Europe would meet just in the middle of the channel and interact. So it was not only a technical aspect but also a symbolic one. So this was really a breakthrough for the channel tunnel studies, and all the subsequent schemes were based at least on things that Thomas de Gamond had realized.
Although de Gamond was a daring pioneer, there was just one problem. No one had dug a tunnel under the open sea before. But on the other side of the channel, one project had pushed the limits of what was achievable. In London, a tunnel had been dug, not under the sea, but under a river. The Thames Tunnel is the only project on which 2 members of the world-renowned Brunel family worked together. Amazingly, the product of that pioneering father and son team survives intact and is still in use to this day. Anglo-French Marc Isambard and his son, the 19-year-old Isambard Kingdom Brunel, began digging the world's first underwater tunnel at Rotherhithe in 1825, just before Tomé de Gamon embarked on his research. Brunel Sr. and Tomé de Gamon knew one another, and de Gamon avidly followed the progress of the Thames Tunnel. I've come to Rotherhithe to meet Robert Hulse, the director of the Brunel Tunnel Museum.
Olivia, hello. Welcome to the 8th wonder of the world.
Lovely to be here.
Follow me.
Robert takes me underground to show me Brunel's remarkable engineering achievement, a twin-track tunnel under the river. Originally designed for horse-drawn vehicles, the tunnel now carries London rail traffic.
And there it is.
The world's first underwater tunnel.
It's tremendously exciting to see the entrance here to the two tunnels.
Yeah, you can see how the tunnel dips under the river because Brunel is trying to get below the blue clay, the strata of blue clay that's impervious.
Brunel used a revolutionary technique to excavate the Thames Tunnel. Called the Tunnel Shield, it was an iron cage that protected 36 miners working at the digging phase. Each man dug a few inches of the clay in front of him, while a gigantic screw jacked the whole structure forwards, inch by inch. Behind came the bricklayers, who lined the tunnel to make it safe. Tunnel shields were widely adopted, and were later used extensively to dig the London Underground. The Thames Tunnel finally opened in 1843. Even with Brunel's innovative tunnelling shield, it had taken 18 years to burrow a distance of less than a quarter of a mile. At that rate, a channel tunnel would have taken centuries to complete. But de Gamon was undaunted. He believed he could dig faster. Although the Brunels had planned the tunnel to be for the movement of cargo, it was initially opened solely as a pedestrian tunnel, and earned its keep as a visitor attraction, charging a penny to enter.
On the first day, there were 50,000 visitors. By the end of the third month, when it opened in 1843, there were 1 million visitors. That's half the population of London in the first 3 months.
The building of the Thames Tunnel was a staggering achievement. The ambition required even to conceive of such a project being possible was enormous. Against all the odds, Brunel father and son managed to achieve what they set out to do: to build the world's first ever underwater tunnel.
Brunel's tunnel under the Thames was absolutely groundbreaking. It proved a point that tunnelling under waterways was now within the ability of engineers of their time.
The tunnel was big news, and engineers the world over were paying very close attention, not least Tomé de Gamon. Back in France, de Gamon was inspired by the example of the Brunels' success. Using the techniques they'd pioneered, he wanted to forge ahead with his own colossal Channel Tunnel project. But he knew that to get a project linking the two nations off the ground would require more than engineering vision. It needed political support.
Tomé de Gamon had friends in high places. By chance, at university, he befriended a certain Prince Louis, who would later become a very important person.
De Gamon's student chum had become the first president of the French Republic. He was none other than Napoleon III, the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon was keen on his friend's plans. If the English had done it under the Thames, why not the French under the Channel? Public opinion on both sides was warming to the idea. Even the notoriously xenophobic British press began to make encouraging noises. It's also said that the famously seasick Queen Victoria supported de Gamon's scheme. Anything to avoid the queasy waters of the Channel.
Everything was in place. The plans were on the table. A tentative trust was growing between the two nations. Surely nothing could stop the tunnel going ahead now.
Just as it was looking like Napoleon would give the plan the go-ahead, an eventful trip to the Paris Opera changed everything. Napoleon III was travelling by carriage along Rue Le Pelletier when he was set upon by a mob led by Italian revolutionary Felice Orsini. Orsini's men threw bombs at the imperial carriage, killing 8 people and injuring more than 100.
Orsini and his men attempted to assassinate Napoleon, and in doing so, halted de Gamon's plans for a Channel tunnel once and for all.
Napoleon emerged unscathed and bravely carried on to take his place in his box at the Opera House, just in time for the curtain to go up on Rossini's William Tell.
What, you may well ask, had this to do with Thomas de Gamon and his Channel tunnel? Well, rather a lot, because the would-be assassin and his British-made bombs had travelled to Paris from England via the Channel.
If an assassin could travel to France without the aid of a tunnel, imagine how much easier it could be in the future for enemies of the state to reach French shores. Xenophobia and international politics had killed off de Gamon's project to link 2 countries in peace and friendship. But as with all good ideas, it wouldn't go away. The idea of a Channel tunnel was kept alive throughout the 19th century by the expansion of rail travel. Across Britain and the continent, there was a civil engineering boom, and everywhere, new tunnels and bridges were helping to slash journey times.
Civil engineering in the 19th century was a game changer. The country was developing from primarily an agricultural economy and was becoming industrialised. So civil engineers were at the forefront of all that and were recognised as national heroes in their time.
Here at the Institute of Civil Engineers in London, the archives are full to bursting with plans lodged by ambitious engineers determined to make their mark on the world.
Civil engineers like Brunel, Telford and Stevenson drove the Industrial Revolution and made their names building great civic infrastructure that still remains to this day. If you could be the man to come up with a way to make the notorious Channel crossing both faster and easier, your name would be sure to go down in history.
I've discovered detailed plans here for all manner of Channel crossings. An international floating tunnel, a cast iron tube, a bridge, and countless designs for tunnels of varying shapes and sizes. Amongst all these plans by aspiring British engineers, I've uncovered something of an unexpected gem.
This is a first edition copy of Thomas de Gamon's plans for the Channel tunnel. But it's a particularly special copy because here at the front, just tipped in, is a letter from Thomas de Gamon himself presenting this book to the library. And in it he talks about his hopes for the project of the Channel tunnel. He describes how he wants the great obstacles that exist to be overcome, and he also describes the idea of the tunnel itself as something which would be both useful and also glorious.
Although the assassination attempt on Napoleon had soured relations between the governments of France and Britain, it hadn't stopped an understanding evolving amongst the engineers of the day. Perhaps the international language of science and technology could succeed where the politics of suspicion had failed. In 1868, the Channel Tunnel baton was passed to a Scottish mining engineer, William Lowe, who'd studied de Gamon's plans. Recognising their brilliance, Lowe built on the Frenchman's achievements and came up with a scheme of his own.
This is an image of William Lowe's plan. It's meticulously drawn, which doubtless helped to sell it as a project to the people who looked at it. And what's astonishing is that even though this was produced in 1868, it's essentially the same type of scheme that we have for the Channel Tunnel today.
Lowe's plan was beautifully simple. It involved two single-bore tunnels, each with a railway track. The two were interconnected by a ventilation system based on those who developed for mining tunnels. His tunnel was to run 23 miles from Dover to Calais, right through the layer of chalk discovered by Thomas de Gamon. Before his death in 1876, de Gamon actually wrote to Lowe. He gave the Scotsman his blessing, saying he'd always hoped to collaborate with a colleague from across the Channel. Lowe was undoubtedly a brilliant engineer, but for his plan to succeed where others had failed, he needed money and influence. Step in Sir Edward Watkin. The Richard Branson of his day, Watkin was a flamboyant rail entrepreneur and MP, an ambitious man with powerful allies in government.
Sir Edward Watkin was the last of the railway kings, a very vigorous man, and he called a spade. He was a Mancunian, and he was a very imaginative man in the sense that, like a lot of Victorians, he thought that if a thing was sound in theory, it would work in practice.
Watkin was a shrewd businessman with an eye on the next big thing. William Lowe's Channel Tunnel design was just what he was after.
He's looking at building a railway link that essentially goes from the Midlands and further north all the way through southern England, through a tunnel into France, and tapping a massive market, and thinks that it's a goer.
This is Abbott's Cliff between Dover and Folkestone. I've come to see for myself how the unbuilt almost happened. Here in 1880, thanks to Lowe's vision and Watkin's money, the business of tunnelling started for the first time in the project's history. They began to dig. Edward Watkin employed a team of Welsh miners. Carving through the white chalk, they began to sink the first shaft for a tunnel to France. Joining me is foreign policy expert Professor Amelia Hadfield, who understands the politics of the day. So we're off to find a spot where they actually started digging in 1880. What had enabled them to begin that at that point?
Well, you have a blossoming, I think, of relationships based on diplomatic agreements between England and France, and fundamentally you have the English Channel Tunnel Company Bill being set before the House of Commons and also the French National Assembly.
Just a few yards further along the shoreline, under the famous White Cliffs, is the place where Watkin's men set to work on this epic undertaking.
This doesn't look like a site of huge historical significance, does it, Amelia? But this is actually the point where they started tunnelling here at Abbott's Cliff. And inside there is the beginning of the tunnel.
Yes, exactly. I know it looks a little unprepossessing. But this is in fact a very historical place in British history and French history as well. To the point, this is where it all began. So you have to, I think, try to imagine beyond the door.
Although Watkins Tunnel remains within the cliffs, a recent collapse means it's too dangerous for us to go inside. But valuable newsreel gives an insight into what lies behind the door.
Near Dover, the old workings are still regularly inspected. This was the start of a pilot tunnel, begun about 1880.
This tunnel was excavated by Watkins' team using a boring machine based on the same principle as Brunel's tunnelling shield. At the same time, a French team on the other side of the channel dug to meet them. Conscious of sensitive public opinion, Watkin promoted the project, throwing banquets and arranging underground visits for the VIPs and celebrities of the day.
He certainly had a PR savvy streak in him, which would seem very contemporary to us now. He was smart enough to bring a few of the great and the good, like Gladstone, for example, the Prince of Wales, and also the Archbishop of Canterbury, and give them private tours. And I think in that sense sort of inculcate a degree of legitimacy about the whole project.
But while Watkin and his friends were partying below the channel, things above ground were beginning to take a turn for the worse.
The War Office got involved and realised perhaps the security implications, obviously the strategic implications, and you just have to look around here to get a sense, obviously, that you're boring into the side of the cliff of a sovereign state with the intention of constructing a subterranean tunnel to another sovereign state. More to the point, I think, is the public outcry that you get surprisingly quickly and with a very sort of poisonous feel to it. In 1882, the front windows of the British Channel Tunnel Company are smashed because of the problems that the British population at this point feel with regards to building a tunnel that can in no way guarantee the security of the island. And Watkin, whose tunnel this is in many ways, is demonized.
And when the upper classes joined the voices of opposition, it seemed that Watkin had at last met his match. A powerful petition was mounted against the project.
In this petition, you see a gathering together of public opinion stretching from the cabinet right down to the man on the Clapham omnibus. All of them voice opposition and, in some sense, real venom with regards to the problems that could arise should relations between the two countries turn sour at any point.
Faced with a groundswell of opposition and grave warnings from the War Office, the government gave in, and in 1882, digging was stopped. Watkin and Lowe's dream of a tunnel under the channel was at an end. It would be almost a century before a channel tunnel project was seriously considered again. Yet again, Britain's xenophobic instincts had won the day. The fraught relationship between Britain and the continent had stymied the cross-channel accord between engineers. Deep underground, there's a telling footnote to this Unbuilt project. An inscription by one of Watkin's men notes the date when the project was begun. Except the word begun is hard to decipher. Would it ever become clear? Britain, and in particular England, was not yet mentally prepared for such a brutal incursion into her shores that would put an end, once and for all, to the splendid isolation of her natural fortress. Britons instinctively believed that the seas surrounding them guaranteed British security. Anything that compromised this threatened their cherished island independence and identity. Perversely, fears of invasion that had once scuppered the plans for a Channel tunnel would later prove to be the driving force behind one of the most ambitious schemes of unbuilt Britain. Hundreds of miles north of the White Cliffs of Dover, it was proposed to cut an enormous battleship canal through the heart of Scotland, just to keep us British. By the turn of the 20th century, Britain had a new and dangerous rival. Germany under Kaiser Wilhelm II was intent on becoming a dominant imperial power, but Britain had long ruled the waves and wasn't about to give that up lightly. To ensure the global supremacy of the Royal Navy, the country embarked on a massive shipbuilding programme.
The first and last line of defence, not just for Britain, but the Empire, is the Navy.
The question for English governments wasn't, do we need a navy? It was, have we got enough navy to do the job? Not to fight anybody, but to make sure that nobody would even think about fighting the British.
At the time, the Navy was glamorous and its admirals celebrities. The man driving the transformation of the Royal Navy was a bona fide star. First Sea Lord Admiral Sir Jackie Fisher. Fisher's determination to win the naval arms race with Germany would lead to another tale of unbuilt Britain. This began in 1906 with a momentous development in the history of shipbuilding: the launch of HMS Dreadnought.
HMS Dreadnought is a revolutionary vessel, the world's first all-big gun, turbine-powered battleship.
It changed the technology of propulsion, it changed the speed at which battleships moved, and it more than doubled their heavy gun armament. It was a raise you and double the stakes motion in a game of high-stakes poker.
Dreadnought changed shipbuilding technology forever, and the Admiralty felt sure this huge battleship was the answer to keeping the peace. But intelligence began to reach Britain of a significant development across the North Sea. The Germans had begun enlarging their Kiel Canal. This was a huge waterway which allowed their battleships to pass between the Baltic and the North Sea, the very arena of a likely future war.
The Kiel Canal is of enormous strategic importance to Germany. It allows them to concentrate their naval assets in one place in total secrecy at will, and there is an argument that we could benefit from something similar.
If the Germans were enlarging their canal, it could mean only one thing. They too had a ship on the scale of Dreadnought.
The British Navy could not be undermined. Britain needed its very own Kiel Canal.
The idea of a British battleship canal was born.
This was a plan that would cut a huge trench straight through the country, a plan that would make Britain war-ready if it could be built in time.
That plan was known as the Mid-Scotland Ship Canal. It was a proposal for a huge canal on the scale of Suez or Panama, the largest man-made waterways in the world.
The problem in Scotland was that many people wanted to build it here, by the bonny banks of Loch Lomond.
Cutting right through the heart of Scotland, it would have provided swift passage for enormous ships sailing between the North Sea and the Atlantic.
The one obvious attraction of
the Mid-Scotland Canal was the link between the East Coast and the West Coast for strategic purposes, the ability to move warships from one side of Britain to the other, from the North Sea into the Atlantic, without having to go up round the north of Scotland.
A canal on the scale of the one being proposed would allow British battleships to avoid the navigation of one of the most treacherous stretches of water in the British Isles, the Pentland Firth at Scotland's northernmost tip.
This canal would not just save time, but countless lives. It seemed just what Britain needed to defend her hallowed shores.
But the idea of building a massive shipping artery through this stunning landscape wasn't new. And profit, not defence, had been the motive. In fact, the route had already been proposed by a group of Scottish merchants keen to expand trade with the Empire. And it was to their blueprints that naval attentions now turned. At the time, two competing plans were drawn up, one by the merchant traders of Glasgow, and a second rival plan by a group of Edinburgh businessmen. The first linked the River Clyde in Glasgow to the Firth of Forth, and was known as the direct route. The rival plan linked the sea lochs of the Clyde estuary to Loch Lomond, and on to the east coast. Accordingly, it was known as the Loch Lomond route. I've come to the archives of the University of Glasgow to look at the only surviving drawings based on proposals for the Loch Lomond scheme.
It is incredibly detailed.
I'm joined here by Professor George Fleming, an experienced civil engineer.
From a civil engineering point of view, how viable was the Loch Lomond scheme?
It was a massive cut from Grangemouth through the Forth Valley into Loch Lomond.
And that's the plan that we can see here.
The plan we see was the line of the canal crossing the Forth Valley and coming out into Loch Lomond and out from the top end of Loch Lomond from Tarbet to Aracher.
The proposed sea lane through Loch Lomond would have been enormous. At 120 feet wide and 26 feet deep, it was equal in size to one of the largest and most difficult engineering projects ever undertaken, the Panama Canal, which took 23 years to complete. The Loch Lomond scheme promised to be an equally complex undertaking.
In this section here, the canal would be running through, but the land mass is much higher. That would involve a cross-section cut shown here, where you're cutting through up to 280 feet down into the base. So you had a 280 feet sheer drop on either side of the canal. And in other parts, your cut would be about 120 feet through solid schist, mica schist.
The unique mountainous landscape around Loch Lomond would have proved enormously challenging to excavate. Cutting hundreds of feet through solid rock to carve a trench as deep as most tower blocks are high is a dizzying thought, and would have wrought havoc for miles around.
This scheme represented a massive cut through the centre of Scotland. Environmentally not acceptable today. Civil engineers essentially build things to service society, and the more complicated a thing, the more excited the civil engineer becomes. And at that time, environmental considerations didn't enter into it.
The evidence from the plans I've studied enables modern 3D graphics to show in dramatic detail the impact of this colossal scheme on the beautiful landscape around Loch Lomond. Dreadnoughts sailing through a vast cutting to the sea head to an enormous docking area at the south of the loch. From here, they sail on to the Firth of Forth and the North Sea. The initial price tag of the Loch Lomond scheme was around £8 million, the equivalent today of £2.7 billion. But the arrival of the enormous dreadnought had an expensive knock-on effect for the canal and all the other naval facilities. Shipyards across Britain were already being overhauled to accommodate her.
The ships get bigger and bigger. That means that the costs of building a canal go up and up and up because you have to make it bigger.
There was a cheaper alternative. The direct route was almost 20 miles shorter than the Loch Lomond route, which on paper at least meant it looked more affordable. It was further argued that this route had much greater potential to pay its way by earning commercial fees, as it flowed directly into Glasgow, then the second city of empire. The financial viability of the proposed scheme had already been demonstrated by an earlier canal.
This is the Forth and Clyde Canal, opened in 1790 for the same reason that the Ship Canal was now desired, to provide a shipping shortcut between the Firth of Clyde on the west coast and the Firth of Forth on the east.
I'm joined on the Forth and Clyde by historian Guthrie Hutton, an authority on Scotland's canals.
Why was it that this canal couldn't be adapted to take larger shipping?
The main reason was the depth. When it was first opened in 1790, the vessels that would be using it were relatively small. It would have been possible to widen it, but not to deepen it. That was the real difficulty.
The surveyors of the Ship Canal quickly ruled out the idea of doing away with the smaller canal and instead decided to build alongside the existing waterway.
The direct route would have been quite devastating. The excavation for a direct route canal running just beside this canal, you can see the countryside there where it would have gone. It would have been an absolutely enormous chasm across the country.
Although the direct route was shorter than the Loch Lomond scheme, it wasn't without its own costly problems.
The infrastructure of central Scotland had kind of built up around the canal. There were a lot of tunnels, for example, going under the canal, railway tunnels, the aqueducts going over roads and so on. Very, very big structures, which would all have had to have been taken down and rebuilt in order to get the greater depth.
Amid claims that the simplicity of the direct route had been overstated, a royal commission into Britain's canals was asked to examine both schemes. It concluded that the cost of both routes had been underestimated, having failed to take into account at least 20 road and rail bridges needed to cross the canal. Both routes now came with an estimated price tag of more than £20 million, or 6.7 billion in today's money. But despite rising costs, supporters of the project still insisted that the canal was something the country had to invest in to ensure national security.
Britain is now locked into a competitive race for naval power with Germany, and seeing who blinks first.
By 1909, the naval arms race had reached fever pitch, and the public were demanding more money to be spent on defence.
The strategic case for the Ship Canal is made quite forcefully, and there is a point when Fisher likes the idea. It would allow movement between the two coasts in total secrecy and absolute safety. Be able to use the shipyard facilities on the Clyde because you can get there freely.
As war with Germany grew ever closer, the prospect of creating a backdoor to these great shipyards of the Clyde made the canal more urgent in the eyes of some.
But Fisher was also pushing the government to build 8 more battleships. The country was once again in the grip of a xenophobic terror. A fearful public got behind him, coining the slogan, "We want aid and we won't wait."
Admiral Fisher used his connections with the press to generate a naval armament scare in which he managed to argue that the Germans were close to the British in the numbers of battleships. And the government eventually caved in and they ordered 8 battleships in 1 year.
This huge shipbuilding programme would cost the country a staggering £16 million. The case for a canal across the country through which these new vessels could sail appeared stronger than ever. But this time, Fisher had gone too far. His additional 8 dreadnoughts had effectively bankrupted the country. Something had to give.
You can say, well, we can have a ship canal, or we can have more dreadnoughts. We'll have more dreadnoughts, thank you.
The arms race, which had been the driving force behind the canal, would prove to be its undoing.
You don't get the same agitation for the ship canal as you do for building more ships. You can't sail the ship canal round the world flying the flag. It's a sort of invisible accretion of extra strength.
The Mid-Scotland Ship Canal had missed its moment. It was simply deemed too expensive at a time when the pull on resources was enormous.
Great engineering schemes are born of trying to solve great problems. But in the face of war, spending a couple of extra days getting from coast to coast was deemed a relatively insignificant inconvenience. Whereas Panama and Suez had shown that they would change the world, the Mid-Scotland Ship Canal failed to convince those in power that it was anything more than a shortcut.
Like many unbuilt plans, the Mid-Scotland Ship Canal lingered on, like a ghost of what might have been. But ultimately, the stars never aligned to allow it to go ahead. Today, Loch Lomond thankfully remains free of warships, the crowning glory of Scotland's first national park. If war and the threat of invasion had been behind the rise and fall of the canal, perhaps even greater schemes might be possible with the outbreak of peace. But as it transpired, it would take 2 world wars and 7 decades before Britain finally felt ready to entertain a more physical relationship with the continent.
The Channel Tunnel was long the dream of its advocates, the joke of its detractors. Now the project is revived as something much wanted, thoroughly practicable. In this rocket age, defense and security objections are much out of date.
In a new era of peace and cooperation across Europe, the idea of a tunnel gained momentum, and in 1974 there was one last thwarted attempt. In an echo of the 1880 dig, the tunnellers bored nearly a mile under the sea before a change of government called the project to a halt. But as European economic and political integration gathered pace, the case for a fixed link seemed irrefutable. Even the naturally Eurosceptic Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was eventually persuaded, and in 1985, her government announced a competition for a fixed link to Europe. This sparked a clutch of grand designs, including Eurotunnel's twin-bore rail tunnel and the incredibly ambitious Euro route, a combined bridge and tunnel scheme.
For a time in the early part of the competition, it did appear that UK government, Margaret Thatcher and the Cabinet favoured the Euro route, the part bridge, part tunnel solution. possibly because it gave full flexibility for car users to simply drive onto the bridge and carry on into France, hassle-free.
Euroroute was the only scheme to offer the freedom to drive straight to France. Vehicles would cross a 4-lane suspension bridge to an artificial island, recalling Thomas de Gamon's early idea of building on the Varne bank. Here, shops and restaurants would cater for the needs of cross-channel motorists. From the island, traffic would drive into a submerged tube tunnel, linked to another island and bridge to France. Running parallel to the road would be a continental rail link. In 1984, this gigantic, awe-inspiring vision was futuristic. It almost seemed too bold. But since then, other bridges have used the same techniques. The famous Øresund Bridge, for example, between Denmark and Sweden, is a hybrid bridge and tunnel linking two countries by road and rail. Euroroute would have been 3 times longer. It's a breathtaking thought. And in the 1980s, when manufacturing was in steep decline, this was just the type of major project to get industry working again. But it didn't happen.
Euroroute probably failed because it was almost double the price of the rail tunnel option. It gave more flexibility. It had some major backers behind it, but ultimately it's the economics that made it a riskier proposition all round.
In 1985, Margaret Thatcher announced the winner of the competition. Eurotunnel got the gig. Euroroute and all the other plans became part of Unbuilt history. However, their legacy lives on in the tunnel we use today. I've come to Folkestone to find out how the early Unbuilt plans helped to bring the tunnel to fruition. Meeting me at the terminal is Eurotunnel's Communications Director, John Keefe.
Hello, John. Good to meet you. John, I've spent so long looking at plans for the tunnel which never were realised that it's still something of a revelation to me that you can get on a train and be in France in half an hour.
Absolutely. If we got on this one, we would be on the platform on the other side in 30 minutes.
Eurotunnel is a rail shuttle service using 2 running rail tunnels and a 3rd service tunnel, which is the one John's taking me into now.
So this is tremendously exciting to be travelling through the tunnel.
That moment when the two shook hands through a hole in the rock that was actually at that point the crossing between Britain and France, a land crossing that hadn't been there since before the last ice age. That's how big it was.
4 years later, the first passengers travelled under the channel. Just as Mathieu Favier, Thomas de Gamon, William Lowe and Edward Watkin had envisaged more than a century before. John's brought me to a point in the tunnel where all the efforts of the past come together.
Well, this is where we have the crossover of all of the different attempts to dig a channel tunnel. If you go back to 1882, we would have had tunnellers coming through from our left-hand side, going right the way through here and heading out to sea. In 1974, the tunnellers dug down from a shaft and headed out to sea. And you can see up here, got 1974 on all of the segments along here. So where we're standing is a sort of crossroads in history. We've got 1882 going this way, we've got 1974 all around us, and then we've got 1986 going off
into the distance and eventually to France.
So this is absolutely the point where those aborted projects of the past come together, where the unbuilt and the built meet and join.
That's it. If we could go either side through these iron segments, we would find the unbuilt Channel Tunnel.
Those early tunnel pioneers, how close did they come to a practical solution for the tunnel?
They were bang on. I think all of the engineers who had anything to do with previous attempts to build a tunnel would be fascinated to come down here, and I think they'd be very proud to know that parts of their thinking is here, right now, inside the modern realisation that they dreamt of so many years ago.
There's no doubt that the Channel Tunnel is one of the wonders of the modern world. It's a marvel of engineering, carrying thousands of passengers for 31 miles under the sea every day. It's also a perfect example of how attitudes to our continental neighbours have helped write the history of our greatest engineering projects.
The political and economic climate was finally right for the Channel Tunnel projects to go ahead in the late 1980s. The Mid-Scotland Ship Canal, by contrast, never quite gained sufficient momentum to convince the governments of the times. To this day, it remains just one of a wealth of ideas that make up the world of unbuilt Britain.
Join me on my next investigation, when I'll discover how the Great Fire of London inspired the most beautiful unbuilt city in Britain, and how the city of Glasgow was nearly demolished by a visionary with a grand plan. Still to come this evening here on BBC4, Alan Wicker is on the last leg of his journey of a lifetime next. And then at 11 we're heading into the heart of the tribe with Bruce Parry. Don't go away.